Welcome back to the Disconnected podcast. I'm your host, Jessica, and today I'll be talking with Dr. Eric Detweiler. Dr. Detweiler is a professor in the English department at Middle Tennessee State University with expertise in rhetoric, digital rhetoric, sound studies, and podcasting. So welcome to the podcast, Dr. Detweiler.
Thank you so much for having me.
No problem. Can you tell us more about your research and areas of expertise?
Yeah, so kind of the two big things that I focus on is first, the history of how we've taught writing and rhetoric. And that's kind of a long-term view there over the course of the last few kind of millennia. How have students in different kinds of cultures and different kinds of settings learned to write, learned to communicate and argue effectively? And the other part of my research is a little bit more contemporary, which is focusing especially on podcasting. How are the ways that we're using this new medium, which kind of puts together long-standing ways of communicating orally using our voices, a lot of the sort of writing and technological bells and whistles that can go into that, creating a new medium for people to communicate and tell stories and share information and all kinds of stuff through. So I guess broadly speaking, just thinking about communication habits, communication technologies, and how those have moved over into educational spaces have been the core of my research for a really long time.
Very cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
How has technology changed the way people communicate? And I know there's a lot to cover here, but just sort of a general overview, some of the highlights of the ways that older and modern technologies, such as writing, talking over the phone, texting, video calling, and then social media, and how have those changed communication?
Yeah, I appreciate the way you frame that there, because this is such potentially a big, broad question. Like I was thinking about one of the little historical nuggets that I end up touching on in a lot of my classes is looking back at some of the dialogues of Plato. So one of the big foundational philosophical figures in Western philosophy. And there's a passage in a dialogue that he wrote called the Phaedrus, where Socrates, this in some ways character who's sort of speaking for Plato, gets really, really grumpy about writing, this newfangled technology called writing, and about the fact that by writing things down, not internalizing them into their body and their sort of soul in the same way, that people are going to sort of lose touch with knowledge a little bit, that it's not going to be quite as close to their heart, and that it's going to be a little bit more of this cold memorization game. And it's weird to me how that ends up getting echoed over and over and over and over again in all kinds of subsequent debates and freakouts sometimes about how technology changes the way that people communicate. These sorts of worries that knowledge is going to become more shallow and more ephemeral, and people aren't going to take it to heart as much. And, you sort of hear this with things like social media or things like that, or even the way it gets flipped now that we take writing itself so for granted, when people worry that texting is going to destroy the next generation's ability to write effectively, when writing itself was at one point that thing that was causing people to get really nervous about what these technologies were going to do. So, I think one of the things that I'm always thinking about when I'm thinking about how technology changes the way people communicate, which is a good question, is that it's easy to either go one way and say, well, it's going to destroy it. Technology is going to ruin our ability to communicate. It's going to make it shallower. It's going to make it less meaningful. It's going to make it so on and so forth. Or, as sometimes happens, to get really, really utopian about it and be like, oh, well, it's going to fix all of our problems. Technology is going to help us become a more democratic society and let everybody participate in the conversation, which also doesn't really tend to be the way things go in a sort of perfect way. So, really, I think technology, maybe if we're focusing, especially more recently, changes the way people communicate, maybe in terms of frequency and in terms of length. Those were two of the things that I was really thinking about when I was mulling over this question. Certainly there are people that I would probably not have talked to in years if I had lived 50 or 100 years ago, who I communicate with pretty frequently and pretty regularly because of things like texting and, messaging on social media apps and things like that. I'm able to keep in touch with them much more frequently because I can just pull out my phone or open up an internet browser and type them a quick message to see how they're doing, see what they've posted recently on Twitter or whatever. And it's also easier in a lot of ways to communicate with them more quickly, to have quicker back and forth. I don't even have to do something like write a really long letter where I try to cover a whole bunch of different things that are going on in my life and give them a really thorough sense of things, and wait a few weeks or a few months for it to arrive, and then wait another few weeks for them to be able to reply. I can ask them a quick question. I can shoot them just a quick text. And so those kinds of rhythms of communication, I think, are one of the big things that really gets impacted by technology. And it even comes down to some of the things like, I don't know, emoji and stuff like that, where you're even able to convey a message, especially if you have a shorthand or a sort of slang you've developed with friends or family, where three little symbols can communicate almost as much as a couple full sentences could communicate in a different setting. Again, to go back, length and frequency, it's those rhythms that really jump out to me as something that changes.
Yeah. It's funny to me that you mentioned at the beginning both Greek history and then the end of what you were saying about emojis, because I had a story about my literature class a couple of years ago. We were discussing a very old Greek poem, and my professor was asking for different interpretations of the poet's meaning of one of the lines. And we were giving all these different interpretations. Could have been somber, could have been really happy, could have been sarcastic. And she said, well, we can only guess at the meaning because ancient Greek people didn't use emojis. So that would have helped us to be able to interpret kind of what they were saying. You mentioned frequency and length of conversation. Do you think that the depth of conversation changes at all with technology?
That's a good question. And I don't really know. I would almost hesitate there just because I think it would almost be too easy an answer to say, oh yes, it's making, like I kind of said earlier, like it's making conversation so much shallower, because we tend to do that with new communication technologies. And I think in some ways you could probably make that case. There are ways where a platform can by design end up leaving people with less room to maneuver in terms of the way that they communicate and the things that they're saying. I mean, of course, you see people who do, like 30 tweet threads and really try to dig into a topic. But there is a little bit of a push, just the design of a platform like that, to maybe get a little bit more vague, a little bit more brief, certainly. And you see all kinds of potential sort of miscommunications, or people who get angry on Twitter because someone else tweeted something that they thought didn't account for some nuance of an issue that's happening. But at the same time, it gives you the ability to, not that some people are going to be obligated to reply to you, but to ask a follow-up question, to ask for a clarification, to come back to it and post later in a way that if you're writing a book or something which may be able to get into a lot more depth, you may not be able to offer that real-time clarification in the same kind of way. So I think it can cut both ways. And a lot of it has to do with, the ways that people figure out how to navigate these platforms, especially when they're new. And like, what are the new behaviors? What are the new jokes? What are the new little tropes, the formats that pop up on these sites and through these platforms? And what are the restrictions that they put in place by design, either in terms of things like character limits, or in terms of, can you attach images? Can you use emoji? Can you upload videos? And all these other kinds of things that start to meld different sorts of technologies together and potentially allow you to add more depth or communicate more quickly in other kinds of ways. So I think it's a pretty contextual question in the end.
Absolutely. So, in that back and forth context, what are some of the pros and cons of communication via technology?
Yeah, when I think about cons, and I know you said pros and cons, but I'm jumping to the cons first anyway. To my mind, one of the big challenges that comes up with some recent technologies come down, I think, essentially to like moderation. And especially with what I kind of see as a lot of, especially like social media platforms and things like that, unwillingness to engage in careful moderation, you can just get a lot of really, really, really toxic stuff. I mean, we see this all the time with trolling and, hate speech campaigns and things like that. And I don't want to make any huge, bold proclamations about how like, oh, well, we used to be nicer to each other and anonymity on the internet has ruined our ability to be kind or anything like that. But I think there are ways where just the sheer volume of participants on some kinds of technological sort of, especially digital communication platforms, have brought new challenges for the people who run those platforms in terms of whether they see themselves as like dedicated to free speech or, not wanting to censor people or things like that, in a way that can make those platforms really, really toxic, often for women or people of color who voice opinions that are seen, or voice factual statements that are seen as worth just going after, and can really stir up some really, really troubling behavior. And there's ways where, as much as, an in-person face-to-face meeting can still get really, really out of control, but there is at least a little bit of a limitation, and usually there to a slightly more localized community in terms of like who is able to show up, how many people are able to show up, what the procedures might be for like running that meeting, things like that. Whereas I think often, because of this unwillingness to moderate, whether because of a fear of driving off users of the platform or being seen as picking sides or things like that, a lot of digital technology really run into some problems with hate speech and becoming just uninhabitable for some users because of the behavior that those users get directed at them for a variety of reasons, but that often sort of echo long-standing trends in who is allowed or not allowed to talk or seen as having meaningful contributions to make to public discourse. But I mean, I think on the flip side, in terms of the pros, they really do. I mean, again, I'm thinking especially about these social media platforms, I guess, can allow people to come together and find commonality in ways that they might not have been able to before. So, lots of communities for potentially like queer people who might have not had peers in their schools or in their immediate communities, at least that they were publicly aware of, but that can find and communicate with communities of people going through similar things online, or even, more mundane, just like interest groups. If you're really into a particular band or a particular video game or something like that, even if you're the only person in your town who's really into that thing, the ability to find affinity communities, which can really be meaningful ways for people to build connections around interests and around parts of their identity that otherwise might have left them fairly isolated if they didn't have some of these digital technologies to sort of rely on.
Yeah. I recently watched the documentary, The Social Dilemma,
Mm-hmm.
and it kind of went over those two ends of the spectrum that you were talking about, with how technology can be really good and it can be really harmful sometimes. In one of the interviews, they were saying that technology can help us reunite with lost family members and find organ donors and do all these positive, amazing things, but then it can also cause us to become addicted to devices that take all of our time and energy and keep us away from genuine connections with people. So there are lots of things on either side, definitely. What are some of the differences in the ways that we communicate over writing and then talking over the phone and then conversing over video?
Oh boy, I sigh there because I was just thinking about the fact that we're conducting this interview via Zoom. And especially with that last part of the question, conversing over video, like I probably would have given a totally different answer 18 months ago than I would give now, having lived
Yeah.
through this kind of period. But I'd probably go back a little bit to some of the stuff I said about rhythms earlier and some of those back and forths. And maybe just to give some concrete everyday examples, I would imagine a lot of us have probably had that experience when you're writing. And when I'm specifically thinking about like writing when you're like texting or writing in a way where you're in some kind of potential like real-time communication with the person on the other end, rather than writing a letter or writing an email or something like that. But I would imagine a lot of us have had that experience where you see the three little dots pop up that let you know that the person on the other end is starting to reply. And you go, oh, I'm going to pause here. I'm going to wait. They might be replying to something that's going to totally change the way that I'm going to reply. And so you sit there and wait. And then, maybe they decide to like get a snack, or it was their cat punching their phone, or they just got distracted or are trying to think of a way to frame something. And so you sit there for like 30 seconds, you put your phone down, you go away, you come back. And even just that little hint that like, oh, this person could be replying, but I'm not sure, can really shift the way that you engage with them. And it's because, again, that very little choice that somebody who is developing one of these message platforms decided at some point, like, I'm going to add some indication that a reply is incoming. And you compare that to like talking on the phone, where if the other person starts to say something, you actually hear their voice begin an utterance, and you may often go like, oh, no, you go ahead. But usually it's a little bit more of an immediate reset to like, who's talking, what were they trying to say, was this the real beginning of a reply, or was this just a straight keystroke or something like that? And so all of those little signals that you can get in real time or with a slight delay, I think make a big difference. And again, you think about something like an email, where even though I know that's maybe usually a little bit more at this point of means of professional communication for people than it maybe was 10, 20 years ago, you can usually sort of plan things out a little bit more, think about what you're going to say, and usually think of it as a really discrete thing that you can work on and you can revise and you can go back to in a way that you can do with text, but people don't tend to do quite as much, because that's usually a little bit quicker real-time form of communication, even though that's not universal. And I mean, with the video stuff, I was thinking in particular about just frankly how exhausting that can be, which is a part of video conversations, I think, becoming a more typical part of people's lives in the midst of a pandemic and a whole bunch of other situations that are already pretty exhausting to navigate. But all of the different ways that seeing your own face reflected back at you in a video call, or the little bit of lag you'll get in Zoom, where you're even more so than a phone call, constantly stepping on other people's lines and things like that, gives you a sense of, I think, without being too quick to say this is great or this is terrible, like a sense of what's different about trying to communicate, even when you can see part of your physical body and the other person's physical body that you're talking to in a video call, from when you're sort of there in person and you don't have some of those little lags when you're maybe a little bit more out of your own head because you're not watching your own face kind of staring back at you. I was starting to read a study just the other day that was kind of about cameras off or cameras on in Zoom classrooms. And I know for a lot of teachers over the last couple of years, regardless of whether or not they ask students to have their camera on, it can be really exhausting to teach to a bunch of black Zoom squares, because you don't have a sense of how people are taking the things that you're saying, or if they're kind of digesting it. And I think for some teachers, there's been kind of a push to go like, you need to have your cameras on, please have your cameras on. But this study I was looking at was basically about like just how exhausting and distracting having your camera on can be for a student, and that it's not really an indication that you're checked out or not paying attention if your camera's off. It can give you a little bit more room to sort of hear and sort of make sense of what other people are saying without paying so much attention to like how you look and how you're going to be perceived, and can really end up being a boon to the learning process and that experience, because it takes some of the pressure of just that constant kind of surveillance of yourself that can happen when your camera's on a Zoom call off of you. So again, I mean, all of these different sorts of the relations you have to other people, the relationships you have with time, the relationship you even have with yourself in these kinds of different technologies, I think all shift it, even from 1 month to the next, 1 year to the next, with the pace at which the ways we communicate with each other and the technologies we use to do so are kind of turning over at this point.
Yeah, I appreciate that you talked about the different social cues and how they're affected, because that's one of the things that I was getting at with this question, is just the way that writing and then talking and then video, you're adding another layer of those social cues. So you can hear someone's voice and then you can see them talking, and it's just a different way of communicating and affects how we communicate with one another. So do you think that our perception of other people changes through these different mediums?
Yeah, I think for sure that is the case to some extent. I mean, you think about something as simple as when you listen to the radio sometimes, or when you listen to a podcast, it's real easy to get a sense of what you imagine the person speaking looks like, whether it's like the host of a podcast you really like, or, a radio show that you listen to. And then I don't know if you've ever had this experience, but I at least a couple of times have had that experience of finally being like, oh, I'm going to go check out the website for this show. I want to learn more about it. And then seeing pictures of the host or the host and being like, that's them? Man, I had like just a totally different mental image. Or, people have this when you see the movie based on one of your favorite books too, and you see one of the characters like, that's not what they look like. So, I mean, I think for sure, like some of the different ways that our bodies do or don't come into play in different kinds of technologies can shift people's perception. Not, in a total 180 completely changes things, but I think there's slightly different orientations that we can sometimes take just based on, again, sometimes negative sort of stereotypes and judgments we might fall back on based on how another person looks or how another person sounds, but also sometimes taking those things out of the equation a little bit and maybe causing us to perceive someone in a different way than we might have if we just ran into them on the street or just, had a face-to-face conversation with them.
Absolutely. Do you think that technology makes it easier or more difficult to form connections or friendships with other people? And again, this can be kind of a mix of both because
Mhm.
that seems to be where we're at.
Yeah, I mean, this maybe I'm overgeneralizing here, but this in some ways strikes me as such like a almost a generational question in some ways in terms of which technologies can do this in different sorts of ways. I'm thinking back even to like the really, really early days of like Usenet and like personal internet connections, where you started to have online forums around certain topics that people could pop into and participate in just those, those first days when you still had, real squawky modems that were getting people connected to the internet. And getting back to something I said earlier, just the ability to form connections with people around shared interests, even if you didn't have people in your immediate sort of geographic social circle who were interested in those things. So I think it can really, you know, help support connection building and even the creation of friendships in those cases. But then I think about the ways that like technologies turn over. And like at this point, for me, Twitter's probably the social network I'm on the most. And a lot of that is communicating with other people who study and research and teach rhetoric and writing. And, especially during the pandemic when we haven't been able to go to conferences in person, just like swapping like prompts for assignments in your courses, or how are you approaching the challenges of teaching X kind of thing on Zoom or whatever it is. And just, that's really helped me sustain connections. But I know plenty of people for whom Twitter is just inscrutable. Like, what in the world is going on? There's so many different people. I can't read this feed. I can't make sense of it. And whether because of just the technologies people have grown up with or personal preferences about with which social networks they like, I think that can be trickier if you're not already sort of familiar with sort of the logics and the ways that these platforms tend to work. And I'm probably hitting that point now in my mid 30s where like I'm probably not ever going to get to know someone through TikTok, because as much as I enjoy watching TikTok videos, I haven't quite been able to put my finger on how that platform operates in terms of like communicating with people and providing either like real-time feedback on streaming videos or comments or what have you on ones that were recorded in advance. And so some of that I think just kind of waxes and wanes with the communities around these platforms. But I think they can definitely help form connections and friendships and help sustain them too. I have friends who are in Kentucky and Utah and Pennsylvania and all over the place, who I probably would have kind of fallen out of touch with in different times, in part maybe just because personally I don't really like talking on the phone all that much, which probably says something about me more than it says about telephones in general. But I'm able to keep up with them and either just passively get a sense of like, oh, their kids just had this birthday and I saw a picture of it that they posted on Instagram, or again, we can just like text real quick and keep in touch. So there's some friendship maintenance that's been able to go on there as well that could have been possible, via analog technology, via phone calls, via letters, via all that kind of stuff, but that is a little bit easier to maintain and then a little bit quicker to sort of catch up on when we do see each other in person through some of these technologies.
Yeah. So, in talking about that, do you think that in-person interactions can be adequately replaced by communication through technology?
This is another one that a year and a half of being on Zoom has probably really shifted my answer to. Because I do think, I mean, as we've talked about a little bit, or at least I've talked about, I guess, that you can have meaningful interactions with people through digital platforms and digital technologies. I have, as I said, some people I've met, but also a lot of relationships that I've just like maintained with people that I can't interact with in person because of quarantining or geographic distance or whatever. But it is a different kind of experience than seeing someone in person. I don't even want to necessarily say better or worse, because in particular, for people who might, not be able to get out and see people in person due to health issues or other things like that. I don't want to say that like you're not having as meaningful an interaction when you interact with someone on the internet than if you would go out there and see them in person. I think we maybe glorify and glamorize face-to-face interactions in some ways. But we have, I mean, for so many people, and there's such a long history of face-to-face interactions were kind of the primary way you might interact with people in your daily life. And so we have all of these rich networks of social habits and cues and behaviors and ability to sort of read each other's bodies in strange ways that we may not even be fully conscious of that can come into play in an in-person interaction. And so adequately replaced, I think these kinds of technologies can give us meaningful kinds of interaction with other people, but I don't know if it's necessarily like a replacement. It may be sort of something different. And keeping in mind that so many of these, texting, social media, video conferencing, all this stuff is at most 30-ish years old or so, still just kind of bubbling up. I mean, maybe we'll get to a point where it's at the same place that writing is a technology that we forget is even a technology because it's so intimately interwoven into our everyday lives. So this is a hard call to make, but I don't think these technologies are just going to vanish. I think they're already facilitating some meaningful kinds of communication and interactions that might once have happened in a slightly different way through in-person interactions. But I don't think it'll be a one-to-one replacement so much as it might be the emergence of new ways of interacting with people that will probably build on the patterns of communication that predate these technologies, and that have sort of structured the way that we tend to communicate with each other, but will also usher in new elements because of the ways that these platforms are designed and built and exploited by their users and played with and all these other things.
Yeah, I think, like you said, it's a very tough call to make, but thank you for your perspective. That's all I have as far as the questions, but is there anything that you want to add?
I don't think so. I hope this was useful. I feel like with all of your questions, I sort of gave like the shruggy emoji. But I've
It's all very confusing.
yeah. There's the tagline for your podcast series. It's all very confusing.
Anyway, thank you for coming on and thank you for talking. That was very helpful. I appreciate it.
Great. Yeah, well, thanks so much for the conversation, Jessica. This is great.